What's up guys, it's Bar, and I figured I'd get my thoughts on Diablo 4 now that the beta is officially over, specifically about build variety and class power. So we're going to go over some issues I think the game has currently. Now I think Diablo 4 was a blast to play, so regardless of what I criticize, do keep in mind that I had fun. I think this is probably the best Diablo we could have gotten given Blizzard's recent track record. Graphically, the game is one of the best ARPGs on the market, if not the best. The cutscenes and stories seem fantastic and dark, and really interested to see how the whole Lilith and Inarius story pan out, as we haven't even seen the other demons yet. And given the game is Diablo 4, we're likely to see Diablo himself, or herself. I don't know what new gender they're gonna do. So excited to see how that pans out. For the starting classes, I do think the 5 are a good mix for launch. Most of the classes were fun, they fit their archetypes appropriately, and exploring the world with them was great. Hopefully Pally gets added and maybe something new later down the line too. But while I think most people will have fun with Diablo 4, that's for the first run, right? What matters for the hardcore ARPG fan is how fun can Diablo stay weeks to months after launch, if not years. I guess I'll start off with the main thing, which is the classes and builds problem. Yes, we don't have Endgame yet, obviously, but there is a core issue that people are not taking into account, which is the skills and class power before Endgame. You know, your first 30 to 60 hours before reaching post-game. This skill tree is all the skills we're going to get in the final game. The only thing we've yet to see is the paragon board and full specializations for each class, but the skills you actually use are just generally going to be these from level 1 to 50 and potentially beyond. And the upgrades to these skills themselves don't really alter them that much either, and balance for skills between classes seem to vary too wildly, with some not even being good until you pick up certain legendaries. For example, the Blood Mist build, which isn't even a build, it's just a legendary, so any build with that legendary just does the same thing. If you clicked one video, you've clicked them all. Because there's no variation you can do with Blood Mist, you're either exploding, or if you don't have the legendary, then Blood Mist becomes absolute garbage, generating just 3 corpses every 20 seconds, which is insanely bad even if you're hard casting Corpse Explosion afterwards, which you can't cast till after you exit the Blood Mist animation, so for 3 seconds you're doing nothing but floating around. Now granted, a legendary taking a trash skill to God tier is kinda cool. However, you're very limited before then, and afterwards you're limited as well, because your build just becomes that after you get the legendary, because it's that drastic of a jump. And in the beta, they buffed the drop rates for legendaries as stated by the PR manager, so in the full game, they're going to be harder to come by, which means you'll have to rely on your skill tree for power. Sorry Druids, which again, skill balance is a bit of a mess. Despite Necro being amazing, it's also got problems within its own toolset. Corpse Explosion versus Blight, for example. Blight deals 300 damage, then 700 on top for 1k total over 6 seconds at the hefty cost of 30 essence. Meanwhile, Corpse Explosion does 700 damage instantly if there's a corpse, and guess what? It costs nothing. So you have this core skill that you have to invest to that is worse for clear than Corpse Explosion, that you can only cast 3 times before having to go back to your basic skill to generate 5 energy per cast, because mana potions don't exist in this game and there's 0 essence generation stats on gear. So you have to hit 3 to 5 times with your basic skill just to do one single cast of Blight, when instead you could have just pressed Corpse Explosion once and clear the entire pack. Both are AoE, except one is vastly better than the other. This resource problem applies to many skills, by the way, not just Blight. Maybe in Endgame, Blight becomes super OP meta, but until then, when you roll a Necro, you're gonna do a Summon build, a Corpse Explosion build, or a Bone Spear build, or a mix between all those 3, and that's it. Also, at least in regards to Necro, it's pretty sad that a minion-based class doesn't have like a buff skill for your minions. Why? There should be a skill I have to cast that gives my skeletons attack up for a few seconds, or makes my shield skeletons taunt or rush to me and block incoming attacks, or maybe one that explodes my golem to deal massive damage. There's just no fancy active support skills for your minions, it's just all passive stuff you get on the tree, which is a bit lame. Now the exception is Rogue, which is actually pretty varied. You got a melee style with Twisting Blades or Flurry, you got range style with Barrage, Penetrating Shot, or Rapid Fire for single target, and then Rogue is one of the few classes with an actual good ultimate skill, Shadow Clone for nice single target DPS or helps with clear, you got movement skills to cross screens, You got buffs of different elements for AoE with shadow imbuement, or DPS with ice and poison. It's got trap skills to help with crowd control. It is one of the few classes where you actually wish you had more skill slots. So it's not like D4 is all bad, there are some classes that get it right. And then there's the Druid.
Monsters around me for 17 damage.
Oh, what a
Druid's super early game issue is 1. The base skills have no good AoE. This win basic skill is a single projectile. Sure, it pierces, but its expanded nodes don't do anything. The bear AoE is quite small and slow to boot. These are your resource generator skills, and they all seem bad. Let's compare it to Necro. I mean, the basic Bone Splinter fires 3 projectiles by default and can point blank an enemy to deal 3 times the damage. And the node after it has a chance to spawn even more. And for AoE, you got the Scythe skill that does a wide AoE hit in front of you. And this just scales upward as you progress the game, as these skills do not get better with normal gear. Secondly, check out the essence cost of Druid's skills. They're really high above the 30s, versus Necro or Rogue, which are mostly sub 25 range. And to add salt to injury, you don't even passively regen energy resource. Why? So not just high skill costs, bad AoE, but also no regen. Whereas Necro and Rogue, hey, we can regen energy by default. So the foundation for Druid is already wrong and should be changed. Forget about endgame balance. The fundamentals of the class are not even good. This leads to a painful leveling experience, and your leveling experience is important because what about making a second character for your next Druid build? What about for each season where your progress is wiped and you have to start anew and can't rely on the crutches of twink leveling gear? What about for a new player starting the game and then they pick Druid only to have hours full of trash and slow combat, struggling against bosses or waves of enemies? That portion of the game is very important. As you see in the back, sped up, this is just me progressing through a side mission boss, and look how bad it is. There's nothing wrong with the build. It's level gear with a few legendaries pre-level 15. But not only as melee do I have to deal with annoying mechanics where bosses spam way too much AoE that either damages me or crowd controls me, but my damage is abysmal with Druid. Because I can't use my skills effectively because they cost too much, and I have no way of regenerating outside of Wolf's Howl or using basic attacks which don't do any damage. So after I killed him, I got the footage for this video and uninstalled the beta. If this is the Druid experience at launch, then F that, I'm not playing this class. So balancing between classes is pretty awful for early game. Barb is the same, and yes, when geared, these perform much better. Barb in fact has some of, if not the fastest clear in the beta when min-maxed. I saw Al Kaiser's Barb video, and yeah, not even Blood Mist Necro can go that fast, nor Sork. Maybe Rogue, since you Twisting Blade then dash to the next pack quickly. But Barbarian, despite complaints, performs well with gear, and it also does super damage with Upheaval. Problem is, that's with legendary gear, and the level 35 weapons that's 200 or more attack than the normal drops of the areas. We're talking about on level as you progress with mostly rares, and as mentioned earlier, they buffed the drop rates for legendaries in the beta, so you likely won't see a full set by the time you reach level 50 when you play at launch. So, Barb and Druid are going to be the worst classes to level with if they stay as they are. People meme about melee being garbage in Path of Exile compared to ranged, but at least melee can clear Act 1 to 10 smoothly, right? So in at least Druid's case, my proposed change is to give it spirit regen. Even 1 spirit per second would go a long way, so I'm not sitting in town with fucking 10 spirit like an idiot. Just being able to go from zone to zone with a full meter like most other classes would be a godsend for this class, and 1 spirit regen is not going to break endgame builds whatsoever. Now for gear, there's very little build altering from normal stats themselves, and stats like willpower or dexterity are kinda garbage in D4, when they're meaningless early on since there are no gear requirements. Like in PoE, if I wanted to use my Tornado Shot bow here, I need to meet certain stats to do so, which means I have to think and alter my build and stats and skills in a certain way to use the good gear I find. The same thing is in Elden Ring, by the way. It's not just PoE. Weapons have stat requirements. Traditional RPGs have stat requirements. In Diablo 4, there's none of that. You just slap on whatever gives green arrow up and move on, making these traditional RPG stats irrelevant. But the stats themselves on rares don't contribute much. It's simple crit chance, overpowered damage, damage reduction, and then +1 skills, but no build altering effects or specialized effects like chance to freeze, chance to burn, flat elemental damage. There's no mana regen, which is dumb that this is not an effect on rares. If it was, then perhaps Druid wouldn't even struggle so badly. There's also no life regen effects. Like, you get what I'm saying? Basic stuff in most ARPGs are missing here. Hopefully they add that stuff so rares can remain interesting, but there's also the gem system, which are absolute garbage. The only neat effects are for weapons, but all the armor and jewelry stuff just giving elemental resistance or crowd control junk is kinda lame. Again, if we can have spirit regen or life leech, or a chance to spawn a barrier or any of that kind of stuff, that would have been great for gems to expand build variety for the gem system. But as it is now, it might as well not exist. It's just more of the same stats you already have. Most legendary aspects don't expand your play or alter a build, no matter how much you combine them. The Bloodlust one is actually one of the few that do so, but aside that, most classes' Legos effects were very independent with little synergy. The exception is Barb, which may be the reason it is so strong with gear, since its legendary effects do stack all well together. So I really hope uniques in the Paragon board and the specializations really come through, because the base tree and most legendaries are not going to change your builds much. But this leads to the last thing, which is the world and endgame for Diablo 4. In Path of Exile, these are just maps. I can modify them in several ways. I have years of mechanics stacked that I can engage with that alter them further or bring me to entirely new mechanics like Heist, Delve, Blight, etc. There's insanely tough bosses like Uber Shaper or Uber Maven that people make entire builds around to kill and farm, and the economy of the game is constantly changing with balances and new skills added every season. Path of Exile is never ending, especially with PoE 2 on the horizon. So I hope D4 can take some things from that, but simplify it to be more enjoyable and easy to take hold of. With the Paragon and unique item system by endgame, it does have a chance to be a long-standing game. They just gotta iron some of the early game class differences out, and hopefully dungeons in the endgame loop are actually good, as Rift and Greater Rifts in D3 were a bore fest. And the fact that their health and stuff scales with your character, it just didn't feel good. After a while, you just lose your power trip eventually in D3, which is not what I want for D4. So personally, I do take issue with the level scaling of enemies. It's fine for bosses, but I think level scaling should trail like 5 to 10 levels behind you. Obviously, if we were level 50, then warp back to Kyovashad and explore it around the region. Obviously, if the enemies were still level 7, that would suck. But level 40? That wouldn't be too crazy, at least for the open world. I guess in the dungeons, maybe you can keep the scaling as they do now, but the dungeons themselves were pretty boring after a while in the beta, with constant reuse objectives. I don't even think there's a dungeon where you just go in and explore and beat whatever monster awaits you at the end or look for treasure like you did in D2. D2 dungeon layouts were random, and the backtracking was simply from RNG of like you took a wrong turn or something. Here, there's no RNG in the dungeons. Dead Man's Dread is the same circle layout every time, but every single dungeon you always have to complete a dumb objective to unlock a door which may lead to the boss or just may lead to yet another puzzle. So I already got tired of this in the beta, and if this doesn't change, I don't know. The endgame might be boring regardless of build variety if there's no other endgame system in addition to this. So that's another issue I hope remains not true. Dungeons didn't feel that fun, and loot in the open world was much worse than loot in dungeons. So you're gonna have to do dungeons if you want those legendaries. The one thing I did like were the open world events. Those appeared randomly, and those were kind of cool. They were more varied than the dungeon puzzles. And the world boss is also kind of cool too. So like Path of Exile, I do hope there are some cool and hard bosses people can challenge for their builds to break away from the dungeon spam. With set bonus gear not being in the base game, I think adding set bonus gear for mainly Uber versions of Diablo or Lilith will be very cool. Like example, the only way to complete Inarius' set bonus is to fight Fallen Inarius, an Uber version of him, where the only way you can get his bonus sword or helmet is from fighting him. You can get the other pieces in other content, but if you want that 7-piece bonus, you're gonna have to fight him. Something like that. I think that would be kind of cool and splits content up so people can engage with more content and not just spam dungeons and get everything they want. In PoE, Uber stuff wasn't mandatory, so as cool as Shaper or Maven was, you kind of could just beat them once for the Void Stone and then forget they exist for the rest of the season. So I think tying set bonuses or uniques to strong bosses where players have to really make sure the build can handle the fight to get that epic loot would be an awesome design choice. So that's my hope for endgame when seasons and stuff start rotating in. But yeah, I hope Diablo 4's longevity can be something people enjoy for years to come. As of now, the only thing I'm thinking about is Diablo 4. I want to play again. I want to play more. So regardless of my complaints, they got me hooked from the get-go. So even if Endgame ends up being repetitive, boring, dog water trash, at least the honeymoon phase is going to be a hell of a ride. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section, thoughts on the beta and the early game, and thoughts and hopes for Endgame. What do you guys want out of Diablo 4? Also, leave a like on the video if you think Druid needs some help for early game. Poor guy, gonna have to play on Veteran 1 difficulty just to enjoy Druid. But yeah, that's it from me. I plan to cover lots of Diablo 4 content in the future, so if you want to see more guides and builds, subscribe for more Diablo epicness.